India and pledged another huge investment to promote the growth of the Indian growth story, digitally wise. So now we are going to look underneath the headlines and try and understand why is it that some of the biggest technology companies and most savvy investors in the world are so excited about the digital opportunities that are here in India. And we're very pleased to present to you Mr. Bret Kinsella, who is the founder and CEO of Voicebot.ai. Let me tell you a little bit about Bret. He's got a very interesting profile. He was named as the commentator of the year in the Alexa conference just last year in 2019, and is widely cited in the media and academic research as an authority on voice assistants and AI. He is also the host of the Voicebot podcast and editor of the Voice Insider newsletter. And he will tell us why is it that the biggest tech companies in the world are so keen on India. Bret, you have a captive audience, and we're all eager to hear what you have to say. The stage is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. I'm really fascinated by what's going on in voice and AI. And what I'll tell you right now is that I've had my eye on India. It was not the first market to sort of explode in the voice AI, the conversational AI interfaces, but it's the one where all of the eyes are really focused on right now. And I think I won't say that all the eyes in the industry or all the eyes who are in the media, but all the eyes are the people who are making investments in voice because they want to grow the footprint. And there's a framework I developed not too long ago which explains why this is. And so when I was talking to Jamal about what you all were going to be doing here, I said, oh, well, this would be the thing that I would want to talk about because I told story about what's going on in voice AI, and it's a really important one, and it's an important one for a lot of strategic reasons. So why India is now the top priority for Alexa and Google Assistant. We can talk about lots of other things if we want to after I go through this, but I want to give you a framework for understanding why this is so important and why the big tech in particular are doing what they're doing. Okay, so all right. So if you don't know who Voicebot is, just go to Voicebot.ai. Go to at Voicebot.ai, at Bret Kinsella on Twitter. We're the central resource for all things voice and AI. We started out just doing this in the U.S. and covering the industry as it grew up here, and this was where a lot of it really started. But we cover Europe extensively. We cover India. I think anybody who's familiar with Voicebot.ai who's watching this and is in India, you'll know that we at least have a story, usually hopefully two stories a week on what's going on in India because it is a very dynamic market right now, and I expect that coverage to continue to increase. And then I also tell people too, and I said this 2 years ago when Europe was just coming up, I said it's really worthwhile for you to sort of look what's going on in the other markets as well, because they basically tell you what's coming to you next. Now, what happens is it gets filtered a little bit because some of the things that aren't working, and basically the U.S., which is sort of the test market for all this stuff right now, doesn't necessarily make it to Europe, or things that go to Europe, worked in the U.S., didn't work in Europe, don't necessarily make it to India. But generally speaking, you're getting the good stuff. You're not getting the canceled products like the Echo Look. You're getting the stuff that actually works. And you're getting the Amazon team and the Google team focused on bringing in brands, media companies of areas that they know are successful. So in many ways, you sort of skip some of the areas where it's already known not to be as successful. But that's where you get we have all this type of information. And I think what we're probably most known for is not just publishing, because we publish 60, 70 articles a month and we track what's going on, but it's really our analysis. And we started out with that analysis in our news stories, and then that just grew into these 40, 50, 60-page reports that we put out from time to time. So I just recommend people go to research.voicebot.ai. There's a lot of free research up there. We also have a paid research service, but there's lots of free stuff too. I recommend you go check it out, what we have there, because I think it'll be instructive for what you're doing. And I actually am looking forward to actually doing some more India-specific work going forward. Okay, enough about that. So one thing I always like to talk about is this, let's frame it. Why is this happening now? Voice and AI, what's the import today? And why didn't this happen 10 years ago? And there's basically three things that are going on. So first, we needed cloud computing. And basically, elastic compute We're not talking about voice on the edge right now. We're just talking about this idea of elastic compute enabled neural networks, which enabled a lot of the other things that we're doing today. And that ultimately then was applied in better ASR, automated speech recognition, better natural language understanding, better natural language generation, all sorts of other tools that people are putting in there, decision engines, dialogue management. But essentially, we had this cloud compute and enabled us to have the scalability we needed for neural networks. And then it became applied, and those applications really set the stage for having something that's actually a true assistant. Okay. So as we even move to the edge, it's a lot of the things that we've learned through the scalability of deploying voice and AI in the cloud that's enabling us to go to the edge and to do it in an efficient way. Okay. So let's just talk about what's at stake, because I'm not going to go through all the things like the error rate's gone down. All these other things are really better. I think other speakers have talked a lot about it, but I want to talk about more the strategy behind it and talk about particularly what some of the big players are doing. So first, I think when I first started talking about this 4 or 5 years ago, this was a newer concept. And many people will have seen this already and started thinking about the user interface revolution. But I want to just drive home a couple of points because I think some of them are often missed. So the first is, back in the 90s, we had this idea of the point and click interface, and that was the big innovation. And the web was really the driver of that. You know, we had Microsoft Windows. Before that, we had the Macintosh, but it was really the web. And that was the platform that we had that we could then distribute content, we could create applications, and everyone could access them through the platform, which is the internet with the web riding on top of it. And then 10 years later, we had touch. It was a new paradigm. We didn't always have a keyboard, and we wanted to be able to do touch and swipe. But the key thing is we had a new platform, and mobile was different than the web, because the web, you had to be at a place really to access it. And then mobile allowed you to be able to access the web, but also all of your other compute anywhere you were. So it's the difference between being at a place where you had compute resources to compute resources always being with you. And we all know that led to all sorts of new capabilities. Whereas in 1990, you weren't distributing media over the internet to everybody into their homes on their desktops. You still were not distributing it to them when they were out and about, when they were on the subway, when they're in their car, when they're in a line waiting for something. But mobile allowed us to do that. And then all these great things happened, things like Hotels Tonight or Uber, or all these things which are mobile specific. Foursquare, people remember that was popular at one point. And then ultimately we hit media like YouTube, Saavn, all the music services that are popular. Spotify is now, I know, coming up in India. But people had all this digital media with them wherever they wanted. And then we got to Speak. And the interesting thing about Speak is a couple of things. One is, it's not a digital interface. We don't use our hands, right? We can speak. Everybody knows how to speak. So that opens it up to far more people. And Google really has talked about this a lot. Amazon some too, but Google's done a lot of this, particularly in India, looking at the ways that you can bring people on or into digital services, give them access to digital services by enabling them to speak. So they don't need to know anything else about the technology. They can just speak, or they can take a picture, and then they can then have the access to these digital services. So speaking is really important. It's also faster and more efficient, in many instances much better. And if you think about all these complex inputs we have to do, or these many swipes and taps to get to something, or the service is there in a mobile app, but it's behind a hamburger menu, it's 3 layers deep, and you don't know how to get it. But if you speak, it can be there instantly. So we have that idea that you can get it faster. And then the other thing that's really unique here is that when we think about it, we also think about this idea of each of these platforms being tied, the previous platforms being tied to a device. So the PC and the web were really co-revolutions. One really wasn't going to go anywhere without the other. And then with the cloud, we needed mobile devices. We needed that first iPhone and some of the original Android devices to show people what they could do, and then really to enable all of these services. So it's that smartphone. And then we had the cloud in the background, which was the ability to deliver all this and update, constantly, provide new services, allow you to connect with things in real time. So it wasn't just the data that was available when you left the home, but it was the data that's available now. So those things came together. When you come to the voice and AI, it's really this idea first. It's decoupled from the platform, so it's many devices. These other platforms, it was the device plus the service. This one is pretty much it's the service on any device, and particularly devices you already own, the car, the television, the smartphone. But then there's new devices because it provides all these new capabilities. So we've got the smartphone, the smart display, and then we've got new features on things like hearables or earbuds. So all these things together, it's an overlooked concept that voice is available on all these surfaces. So it's like water, it's liquid, it goes everywhere. And so that means it can be accessed everywhere. A lot of people think about this idea of ambient, but it's not even just ambient in the areas that we inhabit. It's also in all of the devices that we use or can be very easily. And then the other thing is, if you can see that there in the lower right, it's AI. AI is the new platform. This revolution wouldn't be capable without the AI, because that allows for us to have this new interface. But over time, increasingly, it's going to allow us to do much more meaningful things with our assistants, that they're not only going to be able to interpret correctly what we're doing over time, but they're going to be able to do things for us. And that's where we really get through. And when we think about this idea, we start with platform shifts. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that we're all in for great new services, very different types of things than we've had in the past, and ultimately things that make life better for us. And I think if you look at the web and you look at mobile and you look at voice, I'm sure all of them people will be able to point out negative aspects to them. But for the most part, they've been tremendously beneficial to people. And so when I look at this, when I look at each of these today, the other thing I look at from a tech giant platform is what it did is each of these made the tech giants. So new platform shifts make tech giants, or they reinforce existing tech giants. And that's really an interesting thing that we saw. So if we look at the web, what it really did is, if you think about the tech giants that existed before the web really disrupted that and really think about rearrange the deck chairs in terms of who is important. You know, companies like DEC and AOL and IBM, they were really the dominant companies, and there's a few others that I'm sure we could all bring to mind before the web, are not really the dominant companies today. I mean, obviously IBM's still around. DEC got acquired by Compaq about 20 years ago, right? And so we think about these companies that were really big, they got destroyed by that. But there's something interesting that happens as we've moved forward. Some of these people who made their business around the first platform shift, or the second one, which we'll talk about in a second, they've actually been able to solidify their position or expand their position by expertly navigating that new thing. They're not getting destroyed by the new platform as long as they embrace it and do it better than their competitors. Now, what I think about then is when we have a platform shift, we've got what I'll call the 5 A's. And I've got 4 here laid out because I think the 4 are the most important for the first 2 platform shifts. And this methodology is the things that you get if you become a dominant player. So from an availability standpoint, what we're talking about ultimately is distribution. Can you distribute content? And from an availability standpoint, largely on the web, everybody has access to it. It's an open ecosystem, so anyone can deliver. Now, there are some winners to the extent that YouTube is bigger than Vivo or lots of the other video streaming services. We do have all of these other things, but for the most part, anybody can distribute content because it is an open system. So there's not one winner, but there are many winners, and some are bigger than others. I think it's fair. Acquisition, we talk about that as purchasing, commerce, e-commerce. Amazon clearly won that in the web. I don't think there's any question about that, and they've solidified that more recently with COVID and what's grown in the biggest company the world has ever known. And then we think about authority. So the first thing is, where do you get information and content? The second is, where do you buy things? And the third is, who do you trust? Who do you go to? Who's the information broker? And Google clearly was the winner. And they were actually the 15th, I think, sort of major web browser that was launched. Before them, Yahoo was really the dominant player, and then there were some others that were coming up and challenging Yahoo for that dominance. But Google came in and just won. And so once Web 2.0 was around, they were there. And then we have this idea of attention, but attention doesn't come until the next phase. So when we look at it again, we say, okay, availability. So who's controlling distribution of content? Well, in this case, it's really Google and Apple, so through Android and iOS, because they wound up having the dominant mobile platforms. And so they were ultimately the gatekeepers. And for the most part, they've kept it open. There's a lot of complaints now about sort of the fees they charge, but they saw early on that it was going to be beneficial for them to have this large ecosystem. Clearly, again, in acquisition or in this purchasing e-commerce space, Amazon won again. They transitioned successfully to mobile, and people are ordering desktop, they're ordering on mobile all the time. One-click ordering became particularly useful on mobile. But what they were able to do is unlike IBM or DEC, who basically got displaced in many ways, is in terms of the tech giants, they were able to solidify their position. And then when we get to authority, it's still really Google, but then Apple starts to erode it a little bit because iOS as a platform, will bring up its own search, its own maps, some of its own services first. Still a little bit more Google, and that's just user behavior and the fact that Apple makes its platform available to Google to extend its capability into its platform. But Apple got a little piece of that pie and has grown a number of services around it as a result of it. And then we get to this idea of attention. Attention didn't really matter as much on the web when it was desktop oriented because you could only get people when they were at the desktop. And so you had really a limited window, 3, 4, 5, 6, or maybe 8 if you're thinking about the workday, but just a few hours a day. But then when we moved to mobile, when the devices were always with us, attention really became the story. And I think there's no question Facebook was the winner here. And Google was the other winner, and Google largely through YouTube, but some of its other properties as well. But they were the ones who were able to say, if I've got a few minutes, where am I going? Now, there are other players, obviously, Snap, Twitter, all sorts of other big tech came out of this space. But I think there's no question about it that Facebook and its related properties was one of the winners. And a lot of people say, who won the smartphone wars? And they want to say, well, Android and Apple or Apple, so Google and Apple. They want to say that maybe it was Samsung because they became a dominant smartphone player, and now more recently Huawei. But Facebook was clearly one of the winners. A lot of people overlook that. They didn't even have a mobile strategy. It was one of their problems at their IPO that their mobile strategy was so poor. But they really nailed it. And through the acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp, they extended it. So we have this attention. And then when we get to the new platform, all of those things are up for grabs again, because essentially there's a new way to distribute. So Amazon and Google are the dominant players right now in putting these devices out. But Apple as well, because they have a smartphone ecosystem. And then we've got them. They have a very small presence in the smart speaker space. But when we first brought it out, and we could talk about the evolution, and people have questions about that. But when I think of this as sort of Voice 2.0, Voice Assistant 2.0, where we think about sort of Siri, and before that as the 1.0. Amazon and Google have really had the biggest footprint, and it's been very difficult for other people to dislodge them. From a purchasing and e-commerce standpoint, it's still open. There's not enough volume there today to say that anybody's winning. Amazon has some built-in advantages, but I would say that nobody's really doing that right yet. And so it hasn't. It's growing, but it's like a small percentage of the people who are users of voice. So talk about 15, maybe 20%, depending on what you're looking at. And then we get to authority. Well, if you control the major interface, in this case, if you control the major voice assistant that people are thinking about, Amazon and Google are still having that. Now, there's actually a lot more users on the Microsoft side, or excuse me, not Microsoft, on the Apple side, with Siri, but it just doesn't. doesn't lead to a lot of these things where you actually are delivering authority. They are doing some search, but they're returning search results, and it's really looks more like a mobile play that just has a voice interface as opposed to the assistant. So really, so far, Amazon and Google have been dominant in the early markets where this has grown, and then attention, Amazon and Google. Facebook doesn't really have a play here. They have the portal. They're trying to make a play, but they don't. So let's see. All right. So I want to go back one. It looks like I'm not in full screen anymore. I don't know if you were in full screen.
We have come in.
You still
we're
full
running
screen?
a little short of time, Brett.
Oh, we're running short of time?
Yeah, because it's already 6:45 local time.
Okay. Well, I'll go into this. I'll just do like a couple quick things. So the last thing I just want to talk about.
Take your time. No rush. But we're just a little bit over time, but take your time. No rush.
Okay, no problem. All right. So when we talk about this idea that we have this fight for agency is that the assistant can do things for you. And that's different than what we've had in the past, because the user could always go and get these digital services. But now the assistant could actually know more about you. And we talk about this idea of setting up routines so that we know things are going to happen. And so it's like automation in the background. But as the assistants get to know you better, they're going to do things on your behalf just because they know you want them done. And when that happens, all of this changes, right? Because then the attention and the authority get funneled through them, but also the activity does. And they're going to do things proactively. So I'll just go into a couple other things along these lines, because what's happening here is big tech is focused right now on this and growing these areas of the 5As and asserting their dominance. But they're also looking at regional expansion because they know they need to be dominant in each country. And so if you want to know more about that, you can just go have a Harvard Business Review article on this. If you just go to my Twitter at Bret Kinsella, it's pinned at the top. But I go into this in much more depth. But I wanted to say like two quick things, and I can close this up pretty quickly. We have these global voice assistants that are around, and I think we sort of in big tech, and they've gone in many countries, including India. And then we have these regional players as well that are popping up, and those are really important because they're really localized and have this big impact. And so what we have is like a lot of noise around the world. But the fact is that the voice assistants, whether it's through smart speakers or smartphones or smart TVs or other devices, are actually very broadly deployed today. But there's something that's happening. So if you look at the US, we've got up to almost 100 million people with smart speakers. But you can see that 2 years ago, there was 40% growth. And last year, there was 32% growth. And this year, I'm expecting a lower growth. And so I only brought this up because we've got a third of the population in the US with smart speakers. We've got we've got about 50% more than that who are using voice on smartphones, but the growth rate is smalling because essentially it's getting saturated. And so what the big tech needs to do is they need to fight for each of those areas so they can have attention, agency, and then ultimately the control of the voice assistant for people, but they need new growth markets. And so when I look at India and what I've seen each of the big tech doing, they're looking at it as a large market. It's open. They would absolutely be going after China. Apple is going after China for this, but it's essentially closed to them. So when we look at big markets, the only big market that's really in play right now in a meaningful way is India. And I say it's in play because it's open and there's not a lot of penetration. So the winner has not been set yet. And then the other thing is you have to think about voice as really just a proxy or an on-ramp to be able to expand Amazon and Google's interests in India and other areas, or protect their existing position and mostly expand their interests. So Amazon's really focused on e-commerce. I think the people in this conference will know what they're trying to accomplish in India. It's a very competitive market. They're really trying to push smart home, and look at the smart home projections for India are going to be very significant. That's an area where Amazon believes it can grow quickly, and media. That it has these media properties, whether it's music or video. It wants to be one of those places through Prime and through its other services. It can be a player. Google, everything starts with search for them. It doesn't necessarily end with search, but it always starts with search. And they can't allow someone like Amazon to become the voice assistant, because voice is going to be one of those search things, and it'll start to erode their share. And so having voice, particularly on feature phones, I wrote about this extensively after some interviews with Austin Chang and others at Google last year. And so it's sort of a big story about what they're doing around the next billion digital users, but in particular, how they're going into India, and they're reaching so many people with Google Assistant. It's the same Google Assistant on a feature phone as it is on a smartphone, as it is on a smart speaker. And that's been really important. But that growth of Google Assistant is both in the smartphone, where Android is obviously a popular operating system, but also in the feature phones, where really none of the other voice assistant providers has a play. And then media with YouTube and YouTube Music and other areas. Google has a real interest in this. They're not as focused on this as Amazon, but they're certainly very focused on it. And so I just bring it back to this. I say we have this idea that, what's going on for big tech in terms of their strategy. They want to go in and they want to dominate these 5As for the new platform shift. They've done it. They've already played out a big part of that competition. At least the early stage of it in the U.S., obviously a nice big market. In Europe, they entered that sort of haphazardly, but that's been growing as well. And in Japan, they've done it. China's closed. The only big market for them is India, and India is so important to them for their other parts of their business that it's really changing the way they think about what they're doing. The last thing I'll leave you on is there's been a lot of changes. We've already seen this in Amazon in the US, where they're really focusing much more on the efficiency of it. They've already recognized, they started recognizing this about 18 months ago, that the market was maturing. So now they're looking for growth markets. And so a lot of that effort and initiative that was going into growing the US or Europe is now going in to make sure that they have a strong presence in India and can ride up that growth wave, and hopefully blunt what has it. They want to blunt Google's potential dominance there, because Google has such an advantage with the Android OS and the feature phone deployment, along with all the other service or all the other products they can provide. And so that's what's at stake. Ultimately, what's at stake is, can they keep their franchise? Can they be the key player in the areas that they built up over the previous tech platform shifts? And can they also establish themselves in some of these new areas that they didn't win at, maybe in the previous tech platforms, but in voice, they have a chance to become dominant in areas that they in these other areas as well. And so that's all I have for you today. And that's why India is now the top priority for Alexa and Google Assistant, and will be for at least the next 2 years.
Yes, well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Bret. Appreciate that. I'm going through the Q&A, the discuss panel. There are a bunch of questions. In fact, I myself have a question. We're running a little bit short on time, but if you don't mind, Bret, I will ask you one question from my side.
Sure.
Yeah. So we're talking about how exciting India is as an opportunity for these global tech players. Are you familiar with the ongoing AGR spectrum usage issue here in India? Basically, long story short, the Supreme Court of India has slapped a huge bill of spectrum usage charges on all the telecom players or telecom companies in India. Now, this has come as a totally unexpected, nasty surprise, and it's caused a lot of stir. In fact, it's caused a huge limbo in the entire market, this AGR, adjusted gross revenue spectrum usage issue. So these are the kind of issues that the telecom companies are grappling with in India. Do you think this could pose a threat or a challenge to any outside investors or investors that have already put in their funds into India looking for growth? Or is this something that can just be overlooked? Because this is actually one of the biggest issues. It's not an exaggeration to say this is the biggest issue facing the corporate companies in India right now, especially those who are involved in telecom.
Right. And, well, we've seen a lot of the big tech from the U.S. invest heavily in telecom in India recently. Ultimately, I can see why that would be a big issue today. But when we talk about critical infrastructure and just being able to do that, so what we're talking about is potentially, they're not talking about, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, eliminating the use of this spectrum. but it's basically the margins are going to change because there's going to be higher costs.
Much higher costs.
There's so much money to be made in all of these markets that I think ultimately this will go away. And if it does become detrimental, ultimately, so many people, and particularly India, is more dependent on wireless and mobile than U.S. and Europe, which have a lot more fixed line. Ultimately, it'll start hurting the people if it becomes too onerous, and then there will be some give in the system. So I think that there's no question this probably is a significant issue, not just now, but will play out over the next 12 to 18 months. And I'm no expert on it, but ultimately it's hard for me to believe that the infrastructure is going to stop the advance of digital technologies.
So even though it's such a big issue on the face of it for now, it's not going to deter the international players and even, in fact, the domestic investors and corporations from really taking advantage of the opportunities that lay ahead.
Yeah, and we saw something like this, not quite at this level extreme, but in the U.S. with net neutrality, and when they're talking about essentially regulating internet service providers differently than they had in the past. And then all the investors are like, wait a second, that changes the economic model. So all of a sudden, because of this government regulation, you may have given a 30, 40% haircut into the long-term valuation of this business in terms of what they can actually charge and how they can be effective. And then others we're going to benefit from that because they were going to basically go through regulated rates. And, that's changed back now to the way it was. Maybe it'll go back and forth a few times. But I think, ultimately things didn't change because consumers are going to still use this. And this is what I always tell people about voice is I've been through a number of technology platform shifts. I've been through the ones that we talked about today, which are real shifts. And I've been through some of the pretenders, and I've been through some of the half shifts as well. And when you look at it every time, just look at what the consumers are doing. And ultimately, if the consumers like it, if the consumer data is there, it's a real trend and it's going to have staying power. And then ultimately the barriers are going to be mitigated or come down. Some of them are just, people learn how to deal with them, but others, they ultimately come down. Great question, though. I'm glad to talk about that.
Absolutely. And in fact, from what you said, it could actually be a blessing in disguise because of this overhang. If the valuation of these corporations are going to get a 30% haircut, then what is valued at 100, if it seems attractive at 100, 30-40% means it's now valued at 70. It's an even better investment.
It absolutely might be. I mean, what we've seen in the U.S. is every time it looks like, the infrastructure providers, the telecom service providers, every time it looks like a regulation might hinder their valuation, it actually just locks everybody else out of the market. And they are the only ones left to service the surging consumer demand for all these services. And so I don't think anybody really believes that consumer demand for digital services is going to decline, right? Now, something could happen where infrastructure is destroyed, war, famine, all sorts of things can happen, and this could all go away, right? But unless it all goes away, consumers are going to want more of it because that's what we've seen. We just watch what the consumers do, and they'll tell you what's going to be successful and what's not.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, Bret. We have so many more questions waiting in line. It's a pity that we are completely out of time, but we thank you very much for spending time with us. I'm sure all of our viewers who would like to interact with Bret one-to-one, please feel free to do so offline. You can leave the stage area and meet Bret in the VIP booth. He will be available as with some of the other speakers as well. It's a pity that we can't get to all the questions, but I'm sure Bret will be happy to take them offline.
That's right. I'll go into the VIP area, so I'll answer questions there. And then I'm just at Bret Kinsella on Twitter. If you guys send me a question, just tag Voice Tech Summit, and I'll make sure I answer that question for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bret. Appreciate that. So we will be meeting you offline. And ladies and gentlemen, we have our last presentation in about maybe 5 to 10 minutes time. Please stay online. We will have our last presentation on how to make money using Alexa.